The facility on Arcturus VII had been called temporary for so long that the word lost meaning. Prefabricated structures intended for 5-year deployments had stood for 12, their solar panels coated in the red dust that made everything on this world look like it was perpetually rusting. Dr. Cale Revin had learned to ignore the dust, along with the constant low hum of the mining equipment and the bitter taste of recycled air that no filtration system could completely eliminate. He was reviewing supply inventories in the medical bay when the first tremor hit. Not unusual, Arcturus VII was tectonically active, which was partly why the mineral deposits were so rich and partly why insurance premiums for working here were astronomical. He braced himself against the counter and waited for it to pass. It didn't pass. It got worse. The emergency klaxon started wailing, and Cale's neural implant immediately lit up with distress calls from multiple locations. The processing facility, the one structure that both human and Valkyrie operations shared, because it was more efficient than building separate refineries. He grabbed his emergency kit and ran. The scene at the processing facility defied comprehension. The entire western wall had collapsed, taking 3 floors of equipment and personnel with it. Dust filled the air like fog, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few meters. Emergency lights flickered through the haze, casting everything in irregular pulses of red. Cale's training kicked in, overriding the shock. Triage. Find who you can save them, move to the next. A human miner with a crushed leg, tourniquet pain management, mark for extraction. A Valkyrie technician with severe head trauma, already gone, nothing to be done. Another human, trapped but conscious, directing him toward worse casualties. That's when he found her. The debris had created a pocket of space, and in that space, pinned beneath a support beam that had somehow not crushed her entirely, was Lady Sereth Anara. Cale recognized her from the formal trade meetings. Impossible not to, really. She carried herself with the kind of authority that made even human administrators straighten their postures, and her long ears, which swept back from her head in elegant curves, were decorated with the silver threading that marked her as high nobility. Now those ears were pressed flat against her skull, and the silver threading was lost beneath blood and dust. "Hey," Cale said, dropping to his knees beside her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slightly. They were amber, he noticed, which seemed like an irrelevant detail, except that he needed to check her pupil response, and couldn't remember what normal Valkyrie pupils looked like. "I'm going to get you out," he continued, assessing her visible injuries. The support beam across her torso was the obvious problem, but moving it wrong could kill her faster than leaving it. "Just stay with me." He called for assistance on his comm, but the channels were overloaded with emergency traffic. Right. He was on his own. Cale worked methodically, clearing smaller debris, checking for spinal damage. Difficult when you weren't entirely sure about Valkyrie spinal anatomy, but he made his best assessment, and preparing for the moment when he'd have to lift that beam. "This is going to hurt," he told her, even though she seemed unconscious again. "I'm sorry, but I need to move this and then I need to move you, and neither of those things are going to be comfortable." He positioned himself, braced his legs, and lifted. Human muscles, evolved in Earth's 1G gravity, had advantages on a lighter world like Arcturus VII. The beam rose. Not much, but enough. Sereth made a sound that transcended species' pure pain. I know, Cale said through gritted teeth, his arms shaking from the effort. Almost there. He managed to shift the beam to the side, letting it crash down away from her body. Then he was beside her again, hands moving across her torso, checking for the damage he'd expected to find. Broken ribs, definitely. Internal bleeding, probably. Her breathing was labored, each inhale shallow and pained. He got her onto a stretcher, improvised from a section of wall paneling and some cargo straps, and dragged her toward the emergency shelter that rescue teams were establishing at the perimeter. The night that followed blurred into an endless series of tasks. The emergency shelter had basic equipment but nothing designed for Velkari physiology. Kale made do, adapting human medical technology with the kind of desperate creativity that came from knowing that the alternative was watching someone die. "Okay," he said, mostly to himself since Sareth was unconscious and he was alone in the medical section. "Your people have a 3-chambered heart, I know that much. Which means blood pressure calculations are going to be weird, but the basic principle should hold." He worked in silence for a while, then started talking again. It helped somehow, kept him focused. "You know what's funny?" he said, adjusting the flow rate on an IV line. "Not funny, haha, obviously. This whole situation is pretty definitively not funny, but funny weird. 3 months ago, my sister sent me a message asking when I was going to settle down, find someone, all that family pressure nonsense. And I told her I was too busy keeping minors from killing themselves in creative ways." He checked Sareth's vital signs, frowning at readings that might be normal or might be concerning. He genuinely wasn't sure. "Guess I'm still doing that. Broader definition of minors now." Around hour 5, he ran into a problem. Her breathing was getting worse, and his scans, as much as he trusted scans calibrated for human tissue, suggested fluid building up around her lungs. He needed to drain it, but the procedure was going to hurt, and he'd exhausted his supply of Velkari-compatible sedatives. "Okay," he said, leaning close to her face. "I need you to hear me if you can. This is going to be bad. Really bad. But if I don't do it, your lungs are going to collapse, and then we've wasted a perfectly good night of me talking to myself." He positioned his instruments, took a breath to steady his own hands, and began. Halfway through the procedure, her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with a strength that shocked him. Her eyes opened, pupils dilated, unfocused with pain but somehow locked on his face. Her lips moved. The translator in his neural implant struggled with the whispered words, damaged perhaps by the same seismic event that had caused all this chaos, but it rendered them clearly enough. "Don't. Stop." Kale's heart clenched. She was telling him to continue. Even through the pain, she understood what he was trying to do. "I won't," he promised. "Almost done, just hold on." He finished the procedure with hands that wanted to shake but didn't, because she was trusting him, and he refused to fail that trust. When it was done, when her breathing eased and her grip on his wrist gradually relaxed, he cleaned and bandaged the site with meticulous care. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, visible through the shelter's transparent sections, her eyes opened again. Just for a moment, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't read and whispered those words again. "Don't stop." Then she slipped into what looked like natural sleep, her breathing steady, her vital signs stabilized. Kale sat back, finally letting exhaustion wash over him. "You're welcome," he said quietly. Then, because he was too tired to filter his thoughts properly, "You scared me there for a while. Thought I was going to have to explain to your people that I let their diplomat die because I didn't know enough about Velkari anatomy. That would have been a fun diplomatic incident." He allowed himself to close his eyes, just for a moment. When he opened them again, the sun was fully up, and Velkari officials were standing in the shelter entrance, staring at him with expressions that made his survival instincts start screaming warnings. This, he thought with a sinking feeling, was going to be complicated. The Velkari diplomat who introduced himself as Lord Venal Cross had the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled, and considered the concept of smiling to be a personal insult. His ears, longer even than Sareth's and decorated with elaborate gold threading, swept back from his head in perfect symmetry. "Dr. Ravin," he said, his standard flawless and somehow condescending. "You have been attending to Lady Sareth Anara." "Yes," Kale said, standing up from the chair where he'd apparently dozed off. His back protested the movement with several distinct points of pain. "She was badly injured in the collapse. I've stabilized her, but she needs proper medical care from physicians who understand Velkari physiology better than I do." "Indeed." Lord Cross moved closer, studying Sereth's sleeping form with an intensity that made Kale want to step between them. "We have been informed that you spent the night attending her." "Someone had to, your medical staff." Kale trailed off, realizing there was no polite way to finish that sentence. "Were killed in the collapse. Yes, we are aware." Lord Cross turned his attention to Kale, and there was something in his expression that Kale couldn't identify but definitely didn't like. "Tell me, Dr. Ravin, did Lady Sereth speak during your treatment?" "She was mostly unconscious," Kale said carefully. "She was awake briefly during a procedure, but she wasn't exactly in a condition for conversation. But she did speak." It wasn't a question. Kale felt like he was stepping onto ground that might collapse beneath him at any moment. "She said a couple of words. I took them as encouragement to continue the treatment." "What words specifically?" "I don't," Kale stopped, remembering. "She said don't stop. Twice, actually, once during the procedure and once after." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Lord Cross's ears went completely rigid, and he exchanged looks with the other Velkari officials who had accompanied him. Those looks traveled through a range of emotions that Kale's tired brain struggled to parse. "I see," Lord Cross said finally, each word precisely controlled. "And how did you respond to these words?" "I continued treating her." "That's what she was telling me to do, right? Don't stop the treatment." More exchanged looks. Kale's instincts were now screaming loud enough that he couldn't ignore them anymore. "Dr. Ravin," Lord Cross said, and his tone had shifted to something that sounded like he was explaining a death sentence. "Those words, 'don't stop,' form part of the Velkari bonding oath. They are sacred, spoken only in the presence of one chosen as a life consort. By speaking them to you, and by your continued action in response, Lady Sereth has invoked the ancient rite of bonding. You are by our law bound to her as a chosen partner." Kale stared at him. Then he laughed because the alternative was to scream. That's a misunderstanding. She was hurt, probably delirious. I was just doing my job." "The circumstances of the speaking do not matter. The words were spoken. The action was continued. The bond is formed." Lord Cross's expression suggested he found this situation about as pleasant as Kale did. "This is unprecedented. Lady Sereth is third in line for the high seat. Her bonding affects succession rights, political alliances, the entire structure of our governance. Then we'll just explain it was a mistake. There is no provision for mistakes in the bonding oath. It is considered sacred, inviolable. To suggest it was spoken in error would be to dishonor Lady Sereth in ways that would destroy her politically." Lord Cross paused. "There are those in our court who would prefer that outcome. And there are those who would prefer to eliminate the complication you represent." The threat was politely phrased but unmistakable. Before Kale could respond, human officials arrived, led by Captain Torres, the settlement commander. Torres took one look at the assembled Velkari, at Kale's expression, and said something under her breath that the translator wisely didn't render. What followed was 3 hours of the most surreal diplomatic discussion Kale had ever witnessed. He sat in a conference room, hastily assembled from modular units, while Velkari and human officials debated his life in formal language that barely concealed mutual suspicion and frustration. The facts, as Torres explained them to him during a brief recess, were these. The bonding oath was recognized under Velkari law, which governed all their people regardless of location. The concordance treaties that allowed human and Velkari cooperation explicitly included provisions respecting each species' cultural practices. Legally, there was an argument that the bond was valid. Politically, it was a nightmare. Lady Sereth's bonding to a human, especially a common medic with no political standing or family connections, created complications that neither government wanted to deal with. The Velkari High Council was already divided, with some factions seeing this as an opportunity to weaken Sereth's claim to succession, and others seeing Kale as a threat to be eliminated. "They want you to deny it," Torres said bluntly. publicly refuse to acknowledge the bond, claim ignorance, which is true, and refuse to accept its validity. And Lady Sareth will probably have to renounce her succession rights to save face, but that's not your problem. Your problem is the 3 assassination attempts that intelligence thinks are already being planned. 2 from Velkari factions who want you gone before you complicate things further. 1 from human extremists who think any human-alien union is treason. Kale looked through the window at the medical bay where Sareth still slept, unaware of the chaos her whispered words had created. "What if I don't deny it?" he asked quietly. Tors followed his gaze. "Then you'd better be very sure about what you're accepting, because once you commit to this, the only way out is death. Yours, hers, or both." "That's comforting. I'm not paid to comfort you. I'm paid to explain the situation so you can make an informed decision." Tor stood. "Think about it, but don't think too long. Every hour you delay is another hour for the people who want you dead to make plans." Kale sat alone in the conference room, watching dust particles drift through shafts of artificial light, and tried to figure out how saving someone's life had become this complicated. Outside, through multiple layers of transparent material, he could see Arcturus VII's sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. He had until morning, Tors had said, to decide whether to accept a bond he'd never intended to form or deny it, and let the consequences fall where they would. The decision should have been obvious. It wasn't. Sareth woke on the 3rd day, and the first thing she saw was a human standing guard outside her medical room. The second thing she saw when her vision cleared was Dr. Kale Revin sitting in a chair beside her bed, reading something on a data tablet and looking like he hadn't slept properly since the collapse. "You're awake," he said, setting the tablet aside. His relief was evident even across the species barrier. "How do you feel?" "Like I was crushed beneath a building," she said, her voice rough from disuse. Her memories of the collapse were fragmented: pain, darkness, the certainty that she was going to die in that rubble. And then a human face appearing like an impossibility, working with methodical precision to free her. "That's accurate," Kale said. "You're healing well, all things considered. Though I should mention, there's a small diplomatic situation we need to discuss." The bonding oath. Her voice was steady. She'd expected this conversation. Kale's expression shifted to something between relief and confusion. "So you know about what those words meant." "I spoke them deliberately, Dr. Revin." Silence fell between them, heavy with implications. "But you were injured, in pain, probably not thinking clearly." "I was injured," Sareth agreed. "But I was conscious enough to understand what I was saying." She met his eyes, willing him to understand. "In my culture, the bonding oath is given in moments of absolute vulnerability, when one sees clearly what matters. You worked through the night to save my life. You could have triaged me as too difficult, too risky. You didn't. You spoke to me, even thinking I couldn't hear. You treated my pain as if it were your own. Those are the qualities we seek in a life partner. I was just doing my job. Perhaps that is why it mattered." She shifted slightly, wincing at the pain. "Your job, as you call it, could have been completed with less care. You chose otherwise." Over the following days, Kale visited regularly, ostensibly to check her medical progress, but really, Sareth suspected, because he was trying to understand how his world had tilted so dramatically. They talked carefully at first, then with growing ease. She learned that he'd grown up on a colony world, that he'd chosen medicine because someone needed to, and he'd been good at the science. He learned that she'd been trained from childhood for diplomatic service, that her position in the succession was both privilege and prison. "I can renounce it," she said on the 5th day. "The bond. I can claim I was delirious, release you from all obligation. It would damage my standing, but that may already be beyond repair." Kale was quiet for a long time. "And if I don't want you to?" Sareth's ears tilted forward, surprise. "You would accept it, knowing what it means." "I'm starting to understand what it means. Political complications, assassination attempts, a lifetime of navigating two cultures that don't entirely trust each other. He smiled slightly. Sounds terrible when I list it like that. It does rather, she agreed. But I keep thinking about something you said, about seeing clearly in moments of vulnerability. He leaned forward. These past days, talking with you, learning about your world, I've seen clearly too. You're brilliant, stronger than you probably give yourself credit for, and you care about your people in ways that go beyond political duty. Those seem like good qualities in a partner. You barely know me. True, but I'm a big believer in learning by doing. His expression turned serious. I'm not saying this will be easy. It's going to be complicated and probably dangerous. But I've spent my whole life in complicated situations, and I'm still here. The assassination attempt came 2 days later. A Velkari agent who made it past the human guards, but not past Kale's unexpectedly effective defensive reflexes, honed by years of breaking up fights in mining camps. The second attempt, from human extremists, was stopped by Velkari security, creating an ironic moment of cross-species cooperation. Through it all, Sareth and Kale remained steady. When the Velkari High Council finally summoned them to answer for the bond, they stood together in the council chambers, transmitted via holographic link, since Sareth was still recovering, and faced questions that ranged from procedural to hostile. Lady Sareth, the High Speaker said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. You understand that accepting this bond will affect your standing in succession. I understand completely, Sareth replied. And you, Doctor Ravin, understand that you will be held to the same standards as any Velkari consort, that your actions reflect upon Lady Sareth and her house. I do, Kale said, though I should mention I'm still learning proper Velkari etiquette. I'll probably mess up the formal greetings at least a few times. Several council members made sounds that might have been scandalized or might have been suppressed laughter. The council will deliberate, the High Speaker said finally. You will have our decision within 3 cycles. The holographic connection ended. Kale and Sareth stood in the medical bay, surrounded by guards from both species who had gradually shifted from watching them with suspicion to watching them with something approaching protectiveness. That went well, Kale said. You made a joke about etiquette to the High Council. Too much, possibly just enough. Sareth took his hand carefully, mindful of her healing injuries. Thank you. For what? For not stopping, even when you understood what it meant. Kale squeezed her hand gently. You know what's funny? That night when you said those words, I thought you were thanking me for continuing the treatment. Turns out you were offering me something much more valuable. And what was that? A reason to stay on this dusty, impossible planet. A partnership that makes no sense on paper but somehow works in practice. A future that's going to be complicated but probably never boring. Sareth's ears tilted forward, amusement and affection. You have a gift for summarizing complex situations. It's a medical skill. Explain the diagnosis clearly so the patient knows what they're dealing with. And what is your diagnosis of our situation, Dr. Ravin? He smiled. Prognosis is good. Expected complications, but manageable with proper care and attention. Long-term outlook is excellent, assuming both patients are committed to the treatment plan. That, Sareth said, is the worst medical metaphor I've ever heard. I know. I'm working on it. Outside the medical bay, Arcturus VII continued its rotation, indifferent to the diplomatic revolution occurring on its surface. The High Council would make its decision. Factions would plot. Politics would complicate everything. But in that moment, 2 people from different worlds stood together, bound by words spoken in darkness and choices made in light, and proved that sometimes the most important bonds are the ones formed when we're too busy saving each other to worry about whether it makes sense. 3 cycles later, the High Council's decision arrived. The bond was recognized as valid under traditional law. Lady Sareth maintained her succession rights, though her path to the high seat would now be more complicated. Dr. Kale Ravin was formally recognized as her bonded consort, with all rights and responsibilities that entailed. The announcement caused approximately what everyone expected: political upheaval, diplomatic tensions, and endless speculation about what this meant for human-Velkari relations. In the medical bay on Arcturus VII, Sareth and Kale celebrated by sharing terrible coffee from the human mess hall and reviewing the mountain of legal documentation their union had generated. "Do you regret it?" Sareth asked, scrolling through page 57 of Cultural Obligation Protocols. "Ask me again when we're not reading legal documents," Kale said. Then, more seriously, "No, I don't regret it. Even though your life is now infinitely more complicated. Especially because of that. Turns out I don't do well with simple." He set aside his data tablet. "Besides, someone wise once told me that the important things become clear in moments of vulnerability. That night working to save you, I saw pretty clearly that this was exactly where I needed to be." Sareth leaned against him carefully, mindful of still healing injuries. "Then I suppose we both chose well." "Don't stop," Kale said softly, echoing those words that had changed everything. "Never," Sareth promised. And in the complicated, beautiful, occasionally ridiculous way that the best partnerships form, they began building a future that neither species had thought possible, one careful choice at a time.